Hello and welcome to the Intentional Brief, your weekly video update on the one big thing in cybersecurity news for middle market companies, their investors, and management teams. I'm your host, Shay Colson, managing partner at Intentional Cybersecurity, and you can find us online at intentionalcyber.com. Today is Monday, December 22nd, 2025, and we are barreling towards the end of the year, but the news cycle, cybersecurity and otherwise, doesn't seem to have gotten the memo that it can take its foot off the gas, and so here we are. This week, we are looking at an incident involving a third-party analytics company called Mixpanel, who recently disclosed barely a data breach. The data breach is not barely, the disclosure is. Reporting from TechCrunch and others notes Mixpanel doesn't say how their customers were affected, how many were affected, or what actions they took to remove the unauthorized access that they're talking about. And unfortunately for Mixpanel, they're moving slower than their customers, many of whom have already disclosed their own data loss through this breach, including large and well-known customers like SoundCloud, OpenAI, and 200 million users worth of sites like Pornhub. Reporting from Reuters indicates that the threat actors here are the group known as Shiny Hunters, who we've covered on this show before, several times actually, who are well known to attack companies that are data or access aggregators, including Snowflake and Salesforce, because of the leverage that it gives them to the ultimate consumers or owners of that data. So as usual, companies, particularly in this case Mixpanel, are light on details in a way that does not help other defenders understand either the extent of the breach or the methods by which it was carried out. And that leads us to our main lesson for today, which is keep your own logs and rotate your own keys, because service providers are not going to do it for you. So from a keep your own logs perspective, I understand that it's often not practical, or in many ways not even plausible or contractually allowable, to get logs from third-party providers in the event of an incident or even in the event of normal business operations. But that doesn't mean that you can't at least get some sense of activity, data, users, etc. for these platforms, and finding ways to capture logs about which users, which machines, which services, or which data sets have interacted with your third parties may prove critical when you're trying to understand the levels of exposure in an incident or communicate to leadership just how bad a particular set of events, like Mixpanel's breach, might be for your organization. And you can capture these types of logs in various ways, and I'd consider what the value to your organization might be for all of these, including capturing logs at the edge with your firewall traffic. It can log connections to third-party services, giving you visibility into which internal IPs communicated with which external endpoints, when, how much data was transferred. Even if you don't see the payload itself, you don't need to do break and re-encrypt for deep packet inspection to see this. You could also use a CASB or other SASE style solution. A CASB is a cloud access security broker. It sits between your users and your cloud services, giving you granular logs of who accessed what, from which device, and what actions they took, essentially giving you some audit trails over SaaS usage in a way that the SaaS provider will not give you. You could do a similar thing with proxy logs or API gateway logging, especially if you route third-party API calls through your own gateway like AWS API Gateway or Azure API Key Management or platforms like Kong or others, and then you get the complete request response metadata. You could do application level logging for all of your own self-written components, including timestamps or user context or data objects accessed, response codes, things that are very informative. DNS query logging, which captures the services and endpoints that your systems would be communicating with, even if you can't see the payload. From your own cloud providers, you could get VPC flow logs from AWS or NSG flow logs, right? Network Security Group flow logs from Azure, which show connection patterns to third-party endpoints. Or you could do it on the back end through SIM correlation, aggregating logs from these multiple sources, all of which will give you a more informed perspective about volume and velocity if and when something happens. Rotating your own keys. Beyond just the logs, I think there's other things you need to think about in terms of playing defense from these sort of events and the sort of exposure, including these authentication mechanisms and how you might manage them. So we're talking about things like API keys, which are often long-lived, over-permissioned. So think about building in a rotational schedule and an operational rhythm like quarterly or biannually to ensure you have an inventory of the keys that are used and can update them quickly if a vendor discloses a breach. OAuth tokens, similarly, they often don't expire or don't refresh in a way that other access tokens will, and that's something that attackers are really looking for. So maybe take a look at your applications with OAuth grants and revoke unused authorizations, maybe shorten those token life cycles to something where you can live with it, especially if your vendors allow you to set the duration. Service account credentials, same sort of thing. These are typically machine-to-machine credentials that fly under the radar because humans don't log in with them. They're difficult to add second factors to. They often have broad permissions, and rotating them can be impactful operationally, so they don't get rotated very often. Definitely something to look at. Webhook secrets or signing keys, something that's often overlooked. If a third party sends you webhooks, rotating that shared secret prevents attackers from spoofing inbound data. You can also look at client certificates in a similar way from a mutual use of TLS. These rotation schedule of these certs should also come up. And then federated trust relationships, whether that's SAML or OIDC, looking at those, or personal access tokens, which are developers that can create these to live within a CI/CD pipeline or in their scripts, which often have no expiration. I would say similarly SSH or deploy keys for integrations with our code repositories or our build deploy pipelines infrastructure as code. And then also encryption keys for data at rest. If you're sending encrypted data to a third party, consider whether key rotation is part of that, and be able to understand when and where they are, those keys, so that you can rotate them if the party you've exposed them to has an incident. I think, again, maintaining an overall inventory of these credentials or keys or secrets interacting with third parties is very useful. Think about setting expiration dates, even when they're not required, so that those things limit the amount of exposure. Consider using a secret manager like HashiCorp's Vault or AWS's Secret Manager or Azure Key Vault, rather than hard coding them in places. And then figure out how you'll rotate these if you need to quickly in the emergency event of an incident. You might see this called a break glass procedure. It is a very useful thing to have when you need it, because at the end of the day, you can outsource capability, but you can't outsource responsibility. So plan accordingly, because one of the things that we know will be true in 2026 is that third-party breaches will continue to be a very, very big thing. From a fundraising perspective, we saw nearly $15.4 billion in newly committed capital last week, led by Dragoneer, who raised $4.3 billion for their 7th venture capital fund, and Lightspeed Venture Partners, who put up over $9 billion for a new group of funds, including $2.2 billion for their 15th early stage fund. That goes a long way with early stage ventures. That brings our Q4 total up to $241.6 billion in newly raised capital. By far the biggest quarter in 2025, and a 2025 total to coming in just under, at this point, $600 billion, $599.5. So I suspect we will exceed that with next week's numbers and get over to that $600 billion mark and beyond. We're also starting to see a good set of macro trends, with the New York Times Deal Book noting today that 2025 was a bounce back year for deals. Worldwide volume of M&A hitting $4.8 trillion in 2025, second most of the last decade, only to 2021, which was dynamic in a way that we have not seen and may not see again. The New York Times also notes that 166 transactions were valued at over $5 billion, so definitely some headroom at the top for the big deals. Tech, as you might imagine, dominated activity from a sector perspective, but the Times also notes that leverage buyouts were back in a big way this year, and that PE firms are sitting on over $2.1 trillion in dry powder awaiting investment. So between that amount of ready-to-go capital, signals of a looser, potentially regulatory environment, and a ramping IPO market, we may see 2026 yet be a massive year for both liquidity events and cyber events, and it's something we are absolutely tracking here. As a reminder, as we come to the close of the year, you can find links to all the articles we covered in the comments section below, back issues and written transcripts of these videos at intentionalcyber.com, newsletter at intentionalcyber.com/newsletter, and we will see you next week for another edition the Intentional Brief.